January 30th, 1943. The radio message crackled through the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, barely audible over the constant thunder of Soviet artillery. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's voice, transmitted from Hitler's headquarters over 1,000 miles away, announced Friedrich Paulus's promotion to Field Marshal, the highest rank in the German military. In the basement of the Wehrmacht department store, where Paulus had established his final command post, the newly promoted Field Marshal sat in silence. His staff waited for some reaction, some acknowledgement of the honor. Paulus said nothing. Everyone in that frozen cellar understood what the promotion actually meant. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Not one in the entire history of the Prussian and German armies. The promotion wasn't an honor. It was an order to commit suicide. 24 hours later, Paulus would defy that order and surrender anyway. And when Adolf Hitler learned of this decision, his rage would reveal something he'd spent years trying to hide, that his entire strategic vision for the Eastern Front had been built on a fantasy of willpower overcoming reality, and that fantasy had just collapsed in the ruins of a city on the Volga. But to understand Hitler's reaction, you have to understand how the Sixth Army ended up trapped in Stalingrad in the first place, and why Hitler had convinced himself that surrender was literally impossible. August 19th, 1942. The German Sixth Army, under Paulus's command, had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The city stretched for over 30 miles along the western bank of the Volga River, a sprawling industrial center that produced tanks, weapons, and ammunition for the Soviet war effort. More importantly, it bore Stalin's name. Hitler wanted it for precisely that reason. The symbolic value of capturing the city named after his ideological enemy had become an obsession. Paulus was an unlikely commander for such a critical operation. He'd spent most of his career as a staff officer, meticulous and methodical, more comfortable with logistics than combat command. He'd been chief of staff during the planning for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and had only received command of Sixth Army in January 1942. His colleagues described him as brilliant but cautious, a man who followed orders precisely and agonized over decisions. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of general who would struggle with what was about to happen to him. The battle for Stalingrad devolved into something unprecedented in modern warfare. The Soviets defended every building, every floor, every room. German soldiers found themselves fighting room-to-room battles where the enemy might be 10 feet away through a wall. The city became a maze of rubble where traditional military tactics meant nothing. Soldiers called it the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Life expectancy for a newly arrived German soldier was measured in days. By November, the Sixth Army had pushed the Soviet defenders into a narrow strip of land along the Volga, barely a few hundred yards deep in some places. Victory seemed close. Paulus's forces controlled over 90% of the city. Then, on November 19th, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. The Soviet plan was elegant in its simplicity. While the Germans had focused everything on Stalingrad itself, the flanks of their advance were held by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies, equipped with inferior weapons and low on ammunition. The Soviets smashed through these flanks north and south of the city, then drove their armored spearheads east, meeting behind the German positions on November the 23rd. In 4 days, the entire Sixth Army, nearly 300,000 men, had been encircled. Paulus immediately requested permission to break out. His staff officers calculated they had perhaps 48 hours before the Soviet ring solidified. After that, escape would become exponentially harder. The request went up the chain of command to Hitler's headquarters, to the Wolfschanze in East Prussia, where Hitler was meeting with his senior commanders. Hitler's response came back the same day, quote, 0. The order made no military sense. Every professional officer who saw it understood this immediately. General Kurt Seitzler, chief of the Army General Staff, argued vehemently for a breakout. He pointed out that the Sixth Army would run out of supplies within weeks, that the Luftwaffe couldn't possibly airlift enough food and ammunition to sustain 300,000 men through a Russian winter, that staying in place meant the certain destruction of Germany's finest field army. Hitler dismissed every argument. He had convinced himself of something that would define his reaction to everything that followed, that willpower could overcome material reality. He believed that if the Sixth Army held Stalingrad, it would tie down Soviet forces that could otherwise be used elsewhere. He believed that showing any flexibility, allowing any retreat, would trigger a collapse of the entire Eastern Front. And he believed that Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe could supply the pocket by air. Göring, desperate to restore his prestige after the Luftwaffe's failures in the Battle of Britain, had promised Hitler that the air supply was possible. He claimed his planes could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day, enough to sustain the trapped army. The Luftwaffe's own logistics officers had calculated that the minimum requirement was 700 tons per day, and that even this was barely enough. They told Göring the operation was impossible. Göring ignored them. The airlift began in late November. On the best day of the entire operation, the Luftwaffe delivered barely 300 tons. Most days, they delivered less than 100. The planes flew through terrible weather, attacked constantly by Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns. They landed on makeshift airstrips under artillery fire, unloaded frantically, and took off carrying wounded soldiers who'd been waiting in the snow for days. Hundreds of transport planes were shot down. The pilots called the route into Stalingrad the subzero. Quote 1. Inside the pocket, the Sixth Army began to starve. The daily ration dropped from the normal 3,000 calories to 1,000, then to 700, then to less than 400. Soldiers became walking skeletons. They burned furniture, books, anything combustible to stay warm in temperatures that dropped to -30 degrees. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties. Horses were slaughtered and eaten. Then the rats. The medical stations overflowed with men dying from exposure, starvation, and untreated wounds. There was no morphine. There were no bandages. There was nothing. Paulus sent increasingly desperate messages to Hitler's headquarters. He described the situation in clinical detail, the numbers of dead and dying, the collapse of combat effectiveness, the impossibility of holding out much longer. He never directly challenged Hitler's orders. That wasn't in his nature. But he made the reality clear. The Sixth Army was being destroyed, and nothing was being done to save it. Hitler's responses became increasingly detached from reality. He ordered Paulus to hold and wait for relief. A rescue operation, he promised, was being organized. Army Group Don, under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, would break through the Soviet encirclement and restore the situation. Paulus just needed to hold on a little longer. Manstein did launch a relief operation in December, Operation Winter Storm. His forces drove to within 30 miles of the pocket before Soviet counterattacks forced them to retreat. At one point, Manstein's spearhead was close enough that Paulus's troops could hear the sound of their guns. Manstein sent a message to Paulus. "Break out now, while the corridor is open, or the opportunity will be lost forever." Paulus refused. Hitler had ordered him to hold Stalingrad. Without explicit permission to abandon the city, he wouldn't move. By the time he might have reconsidered, the Soviet forces had pushed Manstein back, and the window had closed. This was the pattern that would define the final weeks of the Sixth Army, opportunities for salvation appearing briefly, then vanishing because Hitler refused to authorize retreat and Paulus refused to disobey. The men in the pocket paid for this paralysis with their lives. January 8, 1943. The Soviets offered terms for surrender. They promised the German soldiers would be fed, given medical treatment, and eventually returned to Germany after the war. They gave Paulus 24 hours to respond. The offer was broadcast into the pocket on loudspeakers, in German, so every soldier could hear it. Paulus forwarded the offer to Hitler's headquarters with a request for permission to negotiate. Hitler's response was immediate and absolute. Reject the offer. Continue fighting. Relief is coming. Paulus obeyed. He rejected the Soviet terms. The Soviet response was a massive artillery barrage that lasted for days, followed by a renewed ground assault. The pocket began to collapse. The Sixth Army was split in two, a southern group centered on the city center and a northern group in the factory district. Communication between them became sporadic, then ceased entirely. The southern pocket, where Paulus had his headquarters, was compressed into an area barely a few miles across. By late January, the situation had moved beyond desperate into the surreal. Soldiers were eating leather, boiling bones for soup, lying down in the snow to die. The wounded filled every basement and cellar, lying in rows in the darkness, their groans audible from the street. There was no medicine, no food, no hope. Officers stopped giving orders because there was no point. The army had ceased to function as a military organization. It was just tens of thousands of men waiting to die. Paulus sent a final message to Hitler on January 24th. It was less a military report than a plea for permission to end the suffering. Troops without ammunition or food, effective command no longer possible, 18,000 wounded without any supplies or dressings or drugs. Further defense senseless. Collapse inevitable. Army requests immediate permission to surrender in order to save lives of remaining troops. Hitler's response arrived on January 30th, Paulus's birthday. Instead of permission to surrender, Hitler promoted him to field marshal. The promotion was announced with great ceremony on German radio. The propaganda ministry presented it as recognition of Paulus's heroic defense. But everyone who understood military tradition knew what it actually meant. In the basement of the Univermag, Paulus's staff officers stood in silence as they listened to the announcement. One of them, Colonel Wilhelm Adam, later recalled the moment. We all knew what it meant. The Führer was telling him to shoot himself. The logic was clear. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. When faced with certain defeat, they had chosen suicide rather than the humiliation of surrender. The most famous example was Field Marshal von Mackensen during the Napoleonic Wars, who had shot himself rather than surrender to the French. Hitler expected Paulus to follow this tradition. The promotion was his way of making the order explicit without having to say it directly. Paulus sat in his command post, staring at the message. His chief of staff, General Arthur Schmidt, argued that they should keep fighting. Schmidt was a committed Nazi who believed in Hitler's vision of willpower overcoming reality. He insisted that relief was still possible, that surrendering would betray the troops who had already died. Other officers argued the opposite, that continuing to fight would just kill more men for no purpose, that they had a duty to save whoever could still be saved. Paulus said almost nothing during these debates. He'd always been a man who followed orders, who operated within the system. Now the system was demanding he kill himself, and he couldn't bring himself to do it, but he also couldn't bring himself to directly disobey Hitler's orders by surrendering. The decision was made for him. On the morning of January 31st, Soviet troops broke into the Univermag. They found Paulus in the basement, along with his staff. There was no dramatic final stand. The Soviet officers were surprised at how easily the Germans surrendered. One Soviet lieutenant later described Paulus as, quote, Paulus was taken into custody. He had not surrendered the Sixth Army officially. He had simply allowed himself to be captured. In his mind, this distinction mattered. He had not violated Hitler's order not to surrender. He had just stopped resisting when resistance became impossible. The northern pocket held out for 2 more days, finally surrendering on February 2nd. Of the nearly 300,000 German soldiers who had been encircled, Only 90,000 survived to surrender. Of those 90,000, only about 5,000 would ever return to Germany. The rest died in Soviet captivity from disease, starvation, and the lingering effects of what they'd endured in Stalingrad. The news of Paulus's capture reached Hitler's headquarters on the afternoon of January 31st. He was in conference with his military staff, reviewing the situation on other parts of the Eastern Front. An aide entered and handed a message to General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff. Jodl read it, his face going pale, then passed it to Hitler. Hitler read the message in silence. Then he stood up from the table and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered forest around the Wolfschanze. The room was completely quiet. Everyone waited for his reaction. When Hitler finally spoke, his voice was tight with barely controlled rage. Quote 5. The statement revealed everything about how Hitler understood what had happened. He wasn't angry that Paulus had lost the battle. He was angry that Paulus hadn't killed himself. In Hitler's mind, Paulus's suicide would have transformed the defeat into a heroic tragedy, a Wagnerian ending that could be used for propaganda purposes. Instead, Paulus had chosen to live, and in doing so had exposed the entire narrative Hitler had built around Stalingrad as a lie. Over the following days, Hitler's anger intensified. In conference after conference, he returned to the subject of Paulus's surrender, his sense of betrayal growing with each repetition. He told his staff, quote 6, "The reference to Varus was telling. Publius Quinctilius Varus was the Roman general who had lost 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD. According to legend, Varus had committed suicide rather than face capture by the Germanic tribes. Hitler saw himself as the inheritor of this tradition of military honor, where death was preferable to the humiliation of surrender. Paulus's refusal to follow this tradition was, in Hitler's mind, a personal betrayal. But Hitler's anger wasn't just about honor or tradition. It was about something more practical and more terrifying, what Paulus might say in Soviet captivity. Hitler understood propaganda. He understood that a captured field marshal was an intelligence goldmine and a propaganda weapon of immense value. He knew the Soviets would interrogate Paulus extensively, extracting information about German strategy, capabilities, and intentions. Worse, they would almost certainly try to use him for propaganda broadcasts, to undermine German morale and Hitler's own authority. In the days after the surrender, Hitler returned to this fear again and again. He told his staff, "In peacetime Germany, about 18,000 or 20,000 people a year chose to commit suicide, even without being in such a position. Here is a man who sees 50 or 60,000 of his soldiers die defending themselves bravely to the end. How can he surrender himself to the Bolshevists? That just doesn't make sense." The statement was revealing in its logic. Hitler couldn't understand why Paulus would choose life in captivity over death. To Hitler, who had built his entire world view around the idea of willpower and the triumph of the strong over the weak, Paulus's choice to survive was incomprehensible. It suggested that survival itself had value, independent of ideology or honor. This was an idea Hitler couldn't accept. His fear about Paulus's propaganda value proved entirely justified. For the first year of his captivity, Paulus refused to cooperate with Soviet propaganda efforts. He maintained his dignity as a German officer and declined to make statements against Hitler or the Nazi regime. But in 1944, after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler in July, Paulus changed his position. He joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-sponsored organization of German prisoners of war who opposed Hitler. He made radio broadcasts urging German soldiers to surrender. He wrote appeals to other German commanders to overthrow Hitler and end the war. He testified at war crimes trials. He did everything Hitler had feared he would do. When Hitler learned of Paulus's broadcasts in 1944, his reaction was vindictive triumph. He told his staff, quote 8, There was a strange satisfaction in Hitler's voice when he said this. Paulus's cooperation with Soviet propaganda confirmed Hitler's judgment of him as weak, as a man who had failed the test of willpower. It validated Hitler's anger at the surrender and his belief that Paulus should have killed himself. But Hitler's reaction to Stalingrad went beyond personal anger at Paulus. The battle's outcome shattered fundamental assumptions that had guided his strategic thinking since the beginning of the war with the Soviet Union. Hitler had believed that willpower could overcome material disadvantages. He had believed that German soldiers, properly motivated and forbidden to retreat, could hold any position indefinitely. He had believed that showing flexibility or allowing retreat would trigger a cascade of defeats. Stalingrad proved all of these beliefs wrong. The Sixth Army had been motivated. They had been forbidden to retreat. They had been promised relief and supply. None of it had mattered. They had been destroyed anyway, not through lack of will, but through simple arithmetic. They ran out of food and ammunition and froze to death. No amount of willpower could change those facts. After Stalingrad, Hitler's relationship with his military commanders changed. He had always been suspicious of the professional officer corps, viewing them as too cautious and too willing to retreat. After Stalingrad, his suspicion hardened into something close to paranoia. He began to see any request for retreat as evidence of defeatism or cowardice. He issued more and more hold-at-all-costs orders, creating more and more situations where German forces were encircled and destroyed because they weren't allowed to retreat in time. The pattern repeated itself throughout the rest of the war. In North Africa, Hitler forbade the Afrika Korps from evacuating Tunisia, and over 200,000 German soldiers surrendered in May 1943. In Normandy, he forbade retreat from the Falaise pocket, and tens of thousands of soldiers were killed or captured. In the Ardennes, he launched an offensive with inadequate supplies and no realistic hope of success, squandering Germany's last mobile reserves. In Berlin, he ordered the defense of the city to the last man, ensuring maximum civilian casualties. Each of these decisions followed the same logic that had led to the disaster at Stalingrad, the belief that willpower and determination could overcome material reality, and that any retreat was the first step toward total collapse. Hitler never learned the lesson of Stalingrad. He couldn't. Learning it would have required admitting that his entire strategic vision was based on a fantasy. Paulus survived the war. He remained in the Soviet Union until 1953, living in a villa outside Moscow, working on Soviet military studies of the Eastern Front. He was allowed to return to East Germany in 1953, where he lived quietly until his death in 1957. He never returned to West Germany. He never wrote memoirs. He gave very few interviews. He seemed to want nothing more than to be forgotten. In the few statements he did make, Paulus was consistent on one point. He had not surrendered to save his own life. He had surrendered to save the lives of his remaining soldiers. Whether this was true or a rationalization, he told himself, no one can say. But it was the position he maintained until his death. Hitler's reaction to Paulus's surrender revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Nazi military strategy. Hitler demanded that his commanders show initiative and flexibility in achieving objectives, but he also demanded absolute obedience to his orders and forbade retreat under any circumstances. These demands were incompatible. A commander couldn't show initiative while being forbidden from making the most basic tactical decision, when to retreat to preserve his forces. Paulus had been caught in this contradiction. He was a careful, methodical officer who followed orders precisely. When Hitler ordered him to hold Stalingrad, he held it, even when holding it meant the destruction of his army. When Hitler promoted him to field marshal with the implicit order to commit suicide, he couldn't bring himself to obey that order, but he also couldn't bring himself to directly disobey by formally surrendering. So he did nothing and waited to be captured, threading a needle between two impossible demands. Hitler's rage at Paulus was really rage at the failure of his own strategic vision. Stalingrad proved that willpower couldn't overcome logistics, that determination couldn't substitute for supplies, that holding ground wasn't always more valuable than preserving forces. These were lessons that every military professional already knew, but Hitler had convinced himself they weren't true, and Paulus's surrender forced him to confront evidence he couldn't ignore. His response was to double down. If the problem was weak commanders who lacked will, then he needed to find stronger commanders and give them stricter orders. If the problem was that soldiers weren't sufficiently motivated, then he needed to make the penalties for retreat more severe. He never considered that the problem might be his own strategic assumptions. In the basement of the Wehrmacht on January 31st, 1943, Friedrich Paulus had made a choice. He chose to live rather than die, to surrender rather than fight to the last man, to save some of his soldiers rather than sacrifice all of them for a symbolic victory. It was a human choice, a rational choice, a choice that any reasonable person would understand. Hitler couldn't understand it. To him, Paulus's choice was incomprehensible, a betrayal of everything Hitler believed about will and strength and the nature of war. His reaction, his rage, and his sense of personal betrayal revealed more about Hitler's own psychology than about Paulus's character. Hitler had built his entire ideology around the idea that the strong survive and the weak perish, that will and determination are more important than material resources or rational calculation. Stalingrad proved this ideology wrong. The Sixth Army had been strong. They had been determined. They had been willing to fight to the death. And they had been destroyed anyway, not through weakness, but through simple logistics and arithmetic. Paulus's refusal to commit suicide was the final insult. It suggested that survival itself had value, that living to fight another day was better than dying for a symbolic victory, that a commander's duty was to his men rather than to an abstract ideal of honor. These were ideas that threatened the foundations of everything Hitler believed. So Hitler raged. He called Paulus weak and dishonorable. He predicted that Paulus would betray Germany in captivity. He used Paulus's surrender as evidence that the officer corps couldn't be trusted, that only absolute obedience to Hitler's own orders could prevent defeat. But the rage couldn't change what had happened. The Sixth Army was gone. 300,000 men had been killed or captured in a battle that achieved nothing, defending a position that had no strategic value, following orders that made no military sense. And the man Hitler had promoted to field marshal, expecting him to provide a heroic ending to the tragedy, had chosen to live instead. That choice, and Hitler's reaction to it, would define German strategy for the rest of the war. Hitler would continue issuing, quote, 10 orders. He would continue forbidding retreats. He would continue believing that willpower could overcome material reality, and hundreds of thousands more German soldiers would die in encirclements and last stands, sacrificed to an ideology that Stalingrad had already proven wrong. On February 2nd, 1943, the last German forces in Stalingrad surrendered. The battle was over. In Berlin, the Nazi propaganda ministry declared 3 days of national mourning. The radio played somber music. Hitler gave no public statement. He never spoke publicly about Stalingrad again. But in his private conferences, he returned to the subject of Paulus again and again, his anger never quite fading.